Ex Nihilo. Martin Burckhardt talking to
Good afternoon, Benedict Beckeld. Welcome to Ex Nihilo. We're delighted to be talking with you about a topic we're noticed the general public is very preoccupied with, even if not exactly the notion of oikophobia that you refer to, which, as you say, goes back to Sir Roger Scruton and loosely translates as the title of your book, Western Self-Contempt. To set the stage of our conversation, could you tell us about the observations and personal experiences that led you to devoting yourself to this question?
Yeah, so thank you for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to speak with you both. On the very first page of the book, I talk a little bit, just anecdotally, to sort of introduce the topic about some of the personal experiences. But essentially, it is something I experienced both here in the United States and in Europe, Western Europe, France, Germany, Scandinavia, certainly Italy as well, even. Which was essentially both as a regular private individual and also as an academic, I experienced this sort of knee-jerk reaction in by which people would, without even seeming to have very much thought about it, automatically sort of ascribed everything that's wrong with the world and all of the ailments of human civilization to their own particular societies. And it wasn't so much that I set out to write a book to explain it. It's just that all of these experiences where I would hear people all the time, both Americans and Europeans, say that, well, the West is at fault for this and that, and America is uniquely evil, and Germany is uniquely evil, and so on. All of those experiences at some point, I guess, served as a stimulant, because then just all of a sudden, I had this sort of moment where the argument or the main argument of the book just sort of presented itself to me without having been asked, but it just sort of came to me. I'm sure as a result of having been stimulated by those experiences, and so I wrote out the argument that came to me. But it was essentially this sort of thing that I'm sure we're all familiar with, when people say that, when Americans think that America is the only country in the world that ever had slavery, or Scandinavians think that foreign cultures are incredibly interesting and authentic and beautiful, whereas Scandinavian culture is non-existent or boring. So all of those things and many other examples like that, they kind of came together to lead me to write this book. Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to add another thought occurred to me when I heard the word oikophobia that Roger Scruton came up with. It occurred to me that, well, we have a word for xenophobia. Everybody knows the word xenophobia, which is, of course, a good thing. Xenophobia is a real thing. There's no question about that. But we should also have a word for the opposite extreme. And the fact that we only have a word for the one extreme, but not for the other extreme, that in itself, of course, is an expression of oikophobia. Because anything that's hostile to foreigners is considered phobic, but that which is hostile to one's own is apparently not considered phobic. So we should have a word for that as well. So.
You've taken up the task of writing something like a universal history of oikophobia. The reason for this seems obvious. If you take a step back, looking at different historical constellations, you start identifying recurring patterns, like once a society has acquired a certain level of wealth, it forgets its beginnings. Instead, people start becoming preoccupied with luxury, like the story Thorstein Veblen tells in his theory of the leisure class. Could you describe the various patterns you've noticed in your particular exploration of history, which could be understood as an archaeology of a moral panic?
First of all, I'm glad to hear the term universal history, because it's maybe a term that has gone a bit out of fashion nowadays. But that's actually part of the problem I've had with the book, in terms of getting people to understand it, because people aren't used to this sort of book anymore. Universal history is something that has to consider lots of different things at the same time, and sort of go into lots of different fields and see how they all sort of come together in the nexus of oikophobia in this case. And people aren't used to that sort of book anymore. People can't really. There are exceptions. I mean, some are, but that's something I've noticed from certain critics, that they are used to books that deal with just one single thing. and we sort of don't have the ability to concentrate anymore on very dense books that deal with lots of different that sort of present a synthesis or universal history of a particular phenomenon, how it expresses itself across a variety of areas of knowledge. So I'm glad to hear that term. But anyway, regarding the pattern, and this is the point, as you say, of universal history, is to sort of take a bird's eye view a little bit, step back, and to see how the same pattern repeats itself across civilizations. There are, of course, differences from civilization to civilization. This is one of my problems with Spengler, for example, is that he makes it sound like as if everything is always exactly the same, which it's not. But the sort of larger patterns that seem to recur anyway, they are that as a society progresses, and maybe this is something we'll talk about further as well, but as a society progresses, it overcomes external enemies, and it is able to achieve a measure of safety, security, wealth, and a leisure class. Early on in a society, the state of the society is precarious enough that sort of everyone has to rally together for its mutual defense. But once a society has become successful, it is able to relegate the fighting or the need for security to a smaller class, and so a leisure class develops that is able to consider its the own society rather than to consider the failings of neighboring societies. And the thing is, we all need, and this is a bit of the more psychological reason, we all need some sort of adversary for the sake of self-identification. And when the adversary is a foreign power, then of course that could stimulate xenophobia, but certainly not oikophobia. Whereas when the adversary has been defeated, the next generation that is only used to peace does not hate the adversary, but it still needs it does not hate the foreign adversary, but it still needs some sort of adversary for the purpose of self-identification, something against which to struggle, because we all need struggle in some way or other. And so the new adversary becomes one's own society. And so those are some of the general patterns. Along with another pattern that also occurs is since one questions one's own society, one also starts to question its traditions, foremost its religion, its gods or God. And the questioning of religion is the most important thing, really, in terms of the questioning of one's own tradition, because the foundation of every society is religious. And so when the gods or God begin to be attacked, the entire society, really, the rest of the society can't really stand and keep functioning without that foundation. And so that's a big part, another recurring pattern that appears. And by criticizing this foundation and by questioning the gods, one of course can also raise oneself. The own person becomes more, the individual becomes more important, as at the expense of the church or the community, as the case may be. And that's another, probably maybe one final point I would make, which is another recurring pattern of the oikophobic or declining phase of a civilization, which is that hyper-individualism appears. The whole idea of a collective becomes weaker. It can reappear again in other forms, such as socialism, for example, which of course is a form of collectivism. But the hyper-individualism and the cult of personality becomes stronger and stronger in the declining phase of a civilization, because when the communal bond of religion collapses, only the individual remains as a social unit, and so only the individual is important, and the rest of society becomes a sort of adversary. So yeah, I would say those are the patterns that we can find in both antiquity and modern times when a society enters its oikophobic phase, and then of course there will be some differences in the details. But I would say in broad brushstrokes, that's pretty much it.
So, Martin and I aren't exactly youngsters anymore, are we? Meaning, we've had the advantage of looking at the present's excessive with a certain reserve. Being children of pop culture, however, we've observed the present's discontent at close range with its search for romanticism in Eastern philosophy, esotericism, and Jesus Christ Superstar, all having played out on a psychedelic stage, as it were. And while much of it has had its justification, it's just ended up repeating what it was fleeing from, whilst trying to create something new, better, more sacred. And when I compare then with now, it feels like that sense of euphoria has slipped into a deep depression, even a form of bitterness or resentment. And that promise of redefining your self-identity as a true self is almost obsessively defining what I'm not, almost as being a nothing where everyone behaves like a victim of being corseted.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah, you're sort of getting at this hyper-individualism a little bit. Everyone behaves like a victim. Victimhood is another one I could have mentioned but didn't. But yeah, thank you for adding that. That victimhood does. Now, victimhood is. I talked a little earlier about the differences between civilizations, that there are those differences. So that's one difference we can sort of ascertain a little bit, in the sense that antiquity, well, certainly pre-Christian antiquity anyway. Well, all of antiquity, none of antiquity had a sense of human rights. And obviously, if you have a sense of human rights, victimhood becomes easier, because if one has a human right, then that's something that can be harmed, and so one becomes a victim. But there is pre-Christian antiquity does well, not only does not have a sense of human rights, it also doesn't have a sense um, of the human qua human being sacred, which comes with Christianity. Stoicism sort of starts going in that direction a little bit before Christianity, but by and large, they don't have that. And so the whole sense of victimhood is a little weaker in antiquity, but one does find it there as well. And the fact that one does find it in antiquity, even though it is, even though they don't have those facets of modernity that we have, that really shows how strong the idea of victimhood is as a civilization declines. You see, the most prominent example, and one I discuss in the book, is in antiquity is Tacitus, who holds up the victimization of the Germanic tribes and the Britannic tribes at the hands of the Romans, and the Romans are the evil conquerors and the brutal imperialists and everything like this, and the Germanic and the Britannic tribes are noble and beautiful and heroic and so on, and are the victims of Roman aggression. So one sees it in antiquity as well. But it, of course, does become even stronger now in modernity, that we do have a sense of human rights, and we do have a sense of the human qua human being sacred. So victimhood is important. You see it obviously everywhere. Now, it leads to the whole idea of victimhood becomes, it goes back to that individualism that you also mentioned, in the sense that when there is only the individual, so when you sort of identify with your whole nation, it's clear that it's a foreign nation or a foreign people that's the adversary. If one identifies with one's church, maybe other churches or other religious communities are the adversary. But when the basic social unit becomes the individual, not even the family, just the individual, then it's clear that the rest of society all of the rest of society is the adversary. And wherever you look around you in your society, you only see an adversary everywhere. You don't see a friendly family, you don't see a friendly church, you don't see a friendly nation. When all of society is one's adversary, as one imagines it anyway, then yes, then this whole sense of victimhood will become exponentially stronger. So that is something we definitely see in as a society declines. And I think victimhood then becomes a way of elevating oneself, certainly, which Tacitus does. He not only says that the Germanic and Britannic tribes are victims of Roman aggression, but they are also beautiful and noble and heroic and so on. Because there is something attractive about being the sort of the underdog against an overwhelming force, the lone individual against the society in which he lives, the society which is an adversary. And so that becomes a certain value that one can employ.
There's this Jewish joke that wonderfully exemplifies the psychology of the oiks, as Roger Scruton has put it. So we're in the synagogue, and it's Yom Kippur, and the cantor sends his personal prayer to heaven. Dear God, Lord of heaven and earth, I'm nothing, simply a nothing. And hearing this, the rabbi follows up with a similar prayer. Oh Lord, I'm nothing, even less than nothing. Now the shamus, the synagogue servant, also wanting to make himself heard, cries out loudly, I too am a nothing, oh Lord, a real nothing. The rabbi, with a sniffing scoff, says to the cantor, look, who thinks he's nothing these days. What's so wonderful clear about this joke is that oikophobia articulates itself as a form of neg identity, and more than that, there's a moral gain to be made from it.
Yes, that's probably the best Jewish joke there is, I think, in my opinion. I love that joke, and not just because it mocks, any joke can sort of make fun of any group. It's easy, but this particular joke happens to really be very Jewish. That's why it's quite funny, because it really captures, an exaggerated form, obviously, but it really captures. It's very Jewish. All Jewish people I know, which is a lot, since I'm Jewish myself, we all love this joke. But in any case, so it does indeed. It does capture it to a considerable extent. Yeah, that sense of victimhood, certainly. I'm not sure if, I don't know if I have anything to add to it, but I think it's a well chosen joke in the context. It's there is the raising oneself raising oneself as a victim. Now, of course, when it comes to the particular context of worship, since there is, one could say, there is something a little, maybe slightly masochistic about a lot of the liturgy, certainly about a lot of the Jewish liturgy.
Really?
Well, I mean, I don't want to maybe take it too far, but in the sense that, I mean, I used to be a practicing Jew myself. I prayed 3 times a day and so on. I was very religious in my early days, and so I do know the liturgy very well, or at least I used to. But and there is a lot of, the whole idea that, we are nothing, and Hashem, God, is everything. The master of the universe and so on, which might sound a little masochistic in that sense, but so to compete in who is the biggest nothing, that's certainly that hits the nail on the head. But I mean, I say that in a friendly way, in an appreciative way, but yes, it's a good joke.
Sure. So as I read your book, which is wonderful and how it challenges the tradition, as a nurse, I kept finding myself wondering if oikophobia isn't an instrument that measures relatively different kinds of oikophobia and its relative strengths across a spectrum, using xenophobia as what it's measured against. And, this relieved out this really curious question for me. What's the advantages to be derived from it? And if that's the case, it seems like there'd be both advantages and disadvantages, like, say, moral megalomania as a form of self-empowerment and potency. And when you speak about a politics of envy, doesn't that presuppose a psychology of a consumptive kind of desire on a mission of either absorbing the other or destroying it? And if it's a diagnosis of severity, how do you treat it? How would you write a prescription?
What would be the prescription? Well, I mean, it is, the whole victimhood is as we've said, it's it becomes almost a form of currency, one can say.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. But when you say the prescription, you mean for the oikophobe himself, or for those who wish to cure the oikophobe?
It seemed, as I was reading the book, is you lay out all kinds of different kinds of oikophobia, and they have different relative strengths. So, I mean, just being a clinician sort, I started trying to lay them out on this spectrum of a disorder and wondering, so where on the disorder does it work positively, and where does it start to work negatively? And when you get into the negative side, what do you do to fix it? Or can you even fix it?
So it's so this is something that is a bit tricky, because if you're looking at the development of oikophobia from from the perspective of the philosophy of history, as I do, it becomes a little difficult to draw a line, if you will, between what is a healthy amount, you might say, of self-critique and a more extreme form of phobic self-hatred. Because it's a spectrum, right? One thing sort of leads into another.
Exactly.
The innovation, if the innovation is the word, the self-critique of the healthy, quote unquote, healthier self-critique of an earlier state kind of serves as a building block for the next step, and so on. And so, it's not so clear cut, I would say, where one can say that, well, this self-critique is good, and here we have something that's a little more corrosive, which is a little unhealthier for the society, or for the individual. And in general, I'm not so because I try to take a more dispassionate or maybe more disinterested view of the development without sort of moralizing too much about what is good and what is bad. That's actually something I've been criticized for a little bit, because people want me to sort of take a further stand for and against particular things in the book. Yeah, and I kind of and I sort of tell them. I mean, that's yeah, no, that's not what you were saying, not at all. But your remarks kind of remind me of that this has been an issue, and because the thing is, we live in such a politically polarized world that everybody wants you to be either for or against something, and to sort of take a strong moral stand. And that's, in that sense, I kind of stand a little closer to someone who is not as well known in the English-speaking world, actually, but he's published a lot in German. Well, he's dead now, but Panayotis Kondylis, who takes a more scientific approach to history. He calls it scientific. He says that we can leave our own morals aside completely when looking at history and be purely scientific. I don't think that's true. I think we're always going to be normative, and we're always going to have our own viewpoints and our own prejudices when we look at history. But his sort of general posture, I think, is correct, is one with which I agree, that when we look at history, it's better to just sort of try to figure out what's going on and to describe it, rather than to say this was good or this was bad. But having said that, the self-critique, when we look at societies, we see, and I think this goes to your question about a prescription or something against this, we see that this sort of slow slide or sort of spectrum, gradual movement from self-critique to more corrosive self-hatred. It's a sort of process that can't really be stopped, or at least, I don't want to say it can't be stopped, because that makes it sound incredibly deterministic, but at least we see has not been stopped so far in various civilizations, and we see it now here in the United States, for example. It's a process that's not being stopped. It just keeps going and becomes more and more extreme. There's resistance to it, but it just keeps going. So I'm not drawing a sharp line between healthy self-critique and corrosive self-hatred, but there is somewhere along there. It is a spectrum. One sees it also. I mean, for example, oikophobia is by and large a left-wing and or progressive phenomenon, but one sees it, for example, in the sense that, and this goes back a little bit to the spectrum, the right now, certainly here in the United States, has been so outraged and disappointed by the excesses of the left that has led to its own critique. And now it's hard to know. So some of the anti-American critique now, we kind of associate anti-Americanism historically with the left and with the progressives and with the Democrats and so on. But now they have taken things so far, the left, right, that the right has started to become anti-American in a certain sense, because they're upset at what they perceive America to have become. And so where to draw the line between the self-critique or the anti-American critique of the right on the one hand, and good and intelligent critique on the one hand, and this sort of knee-jerk anti-American hatred that one now has also started to see on the right, where to draw that line, it's a difficult question. I've noticed more and more now, when I came to, I'm an immigrant to this country, and when I came to the United States in the mid-90s, and if you said that America is the greatest country in the world, the left would be outraged, whereas the right wingers would say, yeah, of course, America is the greatest country in the world, no question. Now, when you say America is the greatest country in the world, people on the right also get sort of outraged, and so now nobody thinks America is the greatest country in the world. So there's still like maybe a little more the moderate right that still think the America is the greatest country in the world, but the sort of the little the sort of isolationist right and the very certain segments of
Yeah.
the right, shall we say, are now just as outraged as the left-wing communists when you say that America is the greatest country in the world. So it's hard to know where to draw those lines exactly. It becomes a bit subjective, and I guess also because it is a bit subjective, it's not a question that I sort of deal with so much. But in terms of the prescription, yeah, it is difficult. The sort of cliched answer is to say that, well, more education is will always cure things. You know, we learn more about our own history and so on. It tends really not to be true, because oikophobia is just as strong among the more academic, educated elites, if anything, even stronger than among the less educated. And so, really, a greater sense of community. Now, how that is supposed to be effectuated is another question. But a greater sense of community, a stronger adherence to traditional forms of worship and so on. And I say that as an atheist. I don't belong to, as I mentioned, I left Judaism, so I don't believe in those things myself. But one still recognizes that religion is the strongest force of communal cohesion that there is. Something that many philosophers through history have recognized. And so trying to get back to some sort of community cohesion, trying to emphasize the importance of the family, especially. Not being less tolerant toward absentee fathers, for example. Getting now into particulars, but those things, anything that can strengthen the family unit as opposed to the individual as social unit, which we talked about before,
Interesting.
goes against this sort of, trying to fight. Individualism is important. I mean, individualism has contributed to a lot of the innovations, of course, that we associate with the West and with the United States, but this sort of hyper-individualism and cult of personality and, I'm right the way I am, and if other people don't like me, they're the ones who have to change. That's all nonsense. Society exists for a reason, as a break. Community is supposed to be a break on our more corrosive impulses. And what other people think of you actually does matter. It doesn't mean that one should be a slave to the passions of other people, but what other people think of you, other people's opinions of you, are supposed to serve as a break on an individual's more corrosive impulses. And so keeping that in mind is, I think, very important if we're going to talk about a prescription. Yeah.
My problem with the question of oikophobia isn't so much of a phenomenological nature, as I agree entirely with the observations, but it concerns the question of its historical cause, namely, whether the whole thing can really be just dismissed as a kind of decadence phenomenon. Let's take the Freudian concept of the uncanny, das Unheimliche, which is familiar to you who speaks German so wonderfully. The uncanny, after all, is so frightening because it takes place in darkness, meaning it's like a horror film score announcing the can opener lying on the kitchen counter is about to attack its owner. It's this sense of the uncanny that I think it's the deepest reason for oikophobia and its scandalon. Altogether, I'm not sure whether self-contempt isn't a kind of paradoxical escape movement where you're fleeing your own home because it's becoming haunted. While on the other hand, your self-incrimination allows you to carry your origins before you like a monstrance. In a sense, identity has tipped over into something negative, a negative identity, a form of megalomania. Germany is a really interesting case of this. The excess of National Socialism has made virtually impossible any sense of national identity, while paradoxically, it's precisely from this stain that a new identity is drawn, where from now on, we Germans excel at being the moral champions of the world.
Yeah, right. So I think, part of it, maybe that goes a little bit to what we were talking about before too, but I think part of what you're talking about is really oikophobia as in its psychiatric dimension. When you talk about das Unheimliche, which is maybe something we should point out for those who were listening and may not be familiar with it. We said that Roger Scruton coined the word. He didn't. It's technically not his. The word itself existed before Roger Scruton, quote unquote, coined it, but it existed in the psychiatric literature. Now, Roger Scruton's innovation was to sort of create a new meaning or a new dimension for the word, namely to apply it to a political philosophical dimension. When you talk about the Unheimliche, the uncanny, that strikes me as more the psychiatric dimension, which is not one that I really deal with, or not really. I don't deal with it at all.
I would like to extend it to
Yeah.
the cultural moment, not to the psychiatry.
Well, I mean, the part of it where I think it's right. I mean, with the can opener and everything, but I mean that is a sense of oikophobia when people are afraid of their refrigerators and things like this, which existed, or of their can openers for that matter, which existed before. But yeah, I mean, what you say about the that one sort of becomes a moral champion as an oikophobe. I mean, I think that's certainly accurate. In Germany, uh, Germany is Germany is maybe not so much a special case because I think the patterns we see in Germany are similar to the patterns we see elsewhere. But maybe Germany is a more extreme case, one can say, because obviously every civilization has crimes in its past or has questionable deeds, but Germany, obviously World War II and the Holocaust are more extreme, of course, than many other crimes, and also they're very recent, still within living memory of some people, and so Germany is a more extreme case in a certain sense. Now one becomes a moral champion by recognizing, and also goes back to the sort of masochistic tendency we mentioned before, that one becomes a moral champion by emphasizing the failures of one's own civilization. But this, again, this is a recurring theme because by pushing down everything that is around oneself, obviously by comparison, one stands relatively higher oneself, and so one becomes a sort of moral champion. Now, and so in that sense, the more extreme the crimes of the past, or at least the more extreme the crimes of the past are perceived to be, the more this sort of moral championship, which goes together with hyper-individualism, because it's the lone individual who's the moral champion, that kind of serves as a compensatory act, we might say, a compensatory act of those previous crimes. Now, in Germany, that you can see that it has led to almost the exact opposite. In milder form, obviously, there is nothing as extreme, of course, going on in Europe now as was the case in World War II. But you see that in Germany, the compensatory act in Germany has gone so far that one is sort of carrying on the same mistakes as before, albeit in milder form. One is one expiates the crime against the Jews by inviting 1 million anti-Semites into the country, and in case someone would say, "Oh, they're not anti-Semites," yes, they are. Yes, they are. It is not the case. Obviously, not every Muslim Arab is an anti-Semite. I want to make that clear. However, to suggest that it's just a small minority that's anti-Semitic is absolutely false. The non-anti-Semites in that part of the world are the exceptions, really. One commits that. That's one way in which one sort of carries on the same error. Again, in milder form, but one carries on the same error. Even mildly right-wing voices in Germany are being censored. Which is, again, another continuation of the same error through the fact that one strives to combat the earlier error. And so the sort of compensatory act reverses back on itself, so to speak, and it becomes a continuation of the same, again, even if in milder form. So I think, in that sense, I'm not sure how much I would associate that with the idea of the Unheimliche, as you say, but I think it's certainly an interesting, it's an interesting suggestion.
What's so curious to me is that when I read Martin's texts, his diagnosis of the discontent of modernity is somewhat similar to yours, only the explanation is different. His analysis is that when a society experiences a rifting in its social structure, it's confronted with a shifting in its mental operating system, what we would call a psychotope, where a crackling rift occurs as a new social drive is powering up to replace the old one. And we're currently in an interregnum between drives. Let's take the end of Bretton Woods, for example. It's the world unchained from its gold standard, isn't it? It's also resulted in the capital no longer residing in the world's capitals, with the nation states and their institutions becoming hollowed out, creating this vacuum of instability. And it's in this interregnum that a deep sense of uncanny develops that you can't quite articulate, where you're no longer a master in your home, which I take as a scandalon lying outside of what we know.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I think this might still also go a little bit to the psychiatric dimension of oikophobia, but I do talk about, I mean, the only appearance I think Freud makes in my book is where I mentioned the fact that he discusses in Das Unbehagen der Kultur, the civilization is discontent in English, where he talks about the Narzissmus der kleinen Differenzen, as he calls it, the narcissism of small differences, which is that the shepherd on the steppe in Mongolia, he's kind of indifferent to us. He doesn't matter. He's so far away. Whereas it's the neighbor, it's Joe down the street who he's the one against whom we're measuring ourselves, and so our antagonism toward him becomes one way in which we sort of elevate ourselves and distinguish ourselves. Goes back, we all need an adversary, right? In which by which we distinguish ourselves against our neighbor, and so the narcissism of small differences is a means by which is something that fuels oikophobia, because we have to distinguish ourselves against our fellow citizens, those who share a culture with us. In terms of I mean, you talk about the rift in society. I mean, there is the idea, something I also talk about in the book, which I think goes a little bit to what you're saying, that we have this sort of neo-tribalism, a sort of fragmentation of society, which is another word for rift. The sense that early society is tribal in a larger sense. The society as a whole is one tribe, so to speak. Whereas through this social rift, society is broken up into smaller tribes, into tribelets, each of which hates the other tribes more than they hate the sort of the far away, the far flung foreigner. And in that sense, there is also in that sense there is this sort of sense of this sort of aimlessness, perhaps one can say, the sort of sense of being on one's own, the loss of a social feeling. This is sort of a neo-tribalism and a fragmentation of society. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Again, the psychiatric dimension. I don't know. You're saying it's not a psychiatric dimension, but it's. In
the Burckhardian, how we look at things is different than Freud. Freud has this private unconscious, and we're looking at a shared unconscious that defines the social background. It's much deeper than just saying a shared social practice.
Right.
It's institutions arise out of it.
Yeah, well, the shared I think that's something that probably happens in a society, because obviously as a society progresses, I talked about before about how society progresses, and it becomes it becomes more fragmented and divided up into more sections. Because you used this Bretton Woods as an example of the sort of decentralization in a certain sense. Cultural capital no longer residing just in the capital, so to speak.
Well, and something stranger happens there, in that the value of the world is unchanged from itself, and it starts to become free floating, and everything becomes fragmented from that.
Which is a deep value crisis, isn't it? Like a Bretton Woods, like means like getting into a post-material world, getting to.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that. I mean, when you're having this sort of, when you have a certain decentralization and neo-fragmentation, I mean, there's nothing, there's no value, there's no conscious value around which everyone can rally. And it leads to sort of aimlessness.
Yeah.
This is also part, I think, maybe a little bit of the democratization that takes place as a society progresses. And we see this again. This is both antiquity and modern times, even if their idea of democracy is not quite the same as ours. As a society advances and becomes more democratized, the number of voices becomes an almost it becomes a din that it just becomes a noise, if you will, because there are so many different voices. There's no ruling class. There is no the hierarchy of a society is conducive to the unity of a society, in the sense that everyone knows his or her place. The more democratized the society is, the more different voices you have. This is something that especially comes through in during the Reformation and the introduction of movable type and the printing press in Europe. So many unruly voices arise that a society can no longer unify. and that leads to a sort of aimlessness, a sort of what was it you called it, a sort of collective unconsciousness or something like this, or that the lack of cultural capital is on a mass level.
Yeah,
like that.
It's a collective unconsciousness.
A collective unconscious is what you called it, right?
Yeah.
So I think, I think, as I understand, if I understand your use of the term, I think this is what happens quite naturally as a society progresses. It becomes a sort of collective unconsciousness because, which is a good term, I think, because because it's a result of democratization, of the progress of technology, and so on. Nowadays, I mean, if one looks around. If one looks everywhere, I mean, YouTube, social media, everywhere, there is such a din of voices that that it's not clear anymore that society has any particular aim. So
you could say that oikophobia is a symptom of complete powerlessness and impotency. And I think this is also what makes the victim role so endlessly attractive. That you can present yourself as the victim of a toxic, malignant system trying to cosset you into something that you're not. Christopher Lasch has caught sight of this mechanism very early on, in the 1970s, when he described how people endowed with a sparsely populated inner life begin to imagine a punishing authority of persecuting your enemies. If we follow this logic, it explains the paradox we're presently observing pretty much everywhere in the Western world, namely that people can talk about living in a toxic system of exploitation, infringing on their basic human rights, while, in the same breath, demanding an expansion of state, which is even more paradoxically supposed to enforce the peace by suppressing hatred and agitation, which is something you observe in your work.
this drive toward egalitarianism, in a way, it's a form of primitivism, one might say, because because earlier, more primitive societies are perceived as being more egalitarian. And you talk about egalitarianism, are perceived as being more egalitarian and less hierarchical and so on. And which is not completely untrue, actually, but that perception. And so it's a form of primitivism in the sense that one wants to go back to earlier days before this whole civilizational superstructure arose, to simpler, to what, at least to what is perceived to be simpler and more egalitarian days. And again, you see this already in Tacitus. I mean, when he talks about the Germanic, to some extent the Britannic tribes, but especially the Germanic tribes, you see primitivism at full work there. And he talks about how they're all more egalitarian in the sense everybody sort of comes together and discusses and sort of try to settle on the right course of action, as opposed to an emperor who issues edicts from on high. So there is that. Now this paradox or this sort of contradiction that you mentioned, in the sense, I mean, you're right. Of course, it is a kind of paradox, but it makes sense, or is less paradoxical, if you will, in the sense that these things have the same goal, the same overarching goal. So on the one hand, breaking down hierarchies and this sort of civilizational superstructure is supposed to lead to more egalitarianism. At the same time, government action can also lead to more egalitarianism because the government can enforce egalitarianism. And so as long as these two opposite poles or the two sides of the paradox, as long as they have the same, or at least are perceived to have the same overarching goal, namely a sort of leveling and a sort of equalization of various forces, then they both serve an oikophobe's purposes. And so this kind of contradiction is something I discuss in the book in a couple of other contexts. For example, the contradiction or the paradox between socialism and postmodernism. There is a tension between socialism and postmodernism, and yet they both can serve the egalitarianism or the equalization of society, and so they are both useful to the oikophobe. Another contradiction, one which I talk about more at length, is the paradox between relativism and positivism, which I talk about not just philosophically but also historically, because they arise at different times in history, but yet in modern times they come together to serve the same goal. So even though there is a paradox between them or a contradiction between them, the oikophobe can use both of them to achieve his goals, to achieve a sort of egalitarianism and to break down to break down hierarchies. Both positivism and relativism can serve these purposes, just like both the breaking down of social hierarchies and concerted government action can serve the same purposes. And so I wouldn't ascribe too much, too much logical thinking necessarily to the Oikophobes. As long as they recognize that all these various factors can serve their purposes, well, then that's fine. Then they're going to worry less about any contradictions or any tensions that might exist between these various weapons that they have at their disposal.
In our conversation with various intellectuals, there's this kind of leitmotif we repeatedly observe. It doesn't matter if we're talking to a journalist about the climate, to an economist about the economy, or to a theologian about the apocalypse. It's the moment when everybody says, well, we just live in an attention economy. Now, I understand this rifting as the moment when everyone's becoming aware that the general public sphere is just a stage, a moral institution where, as in the Middle Ages, we're again seeing a pillory with its talk of apostates and deniers and the like. And it's with this in mind you understand the value of the victim role. It seems to be an excellent part, playing the victim who's so badly treated by the world, because in this position, you can bank it as a surplus value in the moral economy, can't you? Otherwise, how do you explain that so many renowned institutions are joining these positions that, when seen in the day of light, amount to destroying their integrity and destabilizing our social fabric?
Well, I think that the fact that institutions do that is in and of itself a sign of how far this sort of hyper-individualism has gone, and the victim, because the institutions, I wouldn't think so much of so many of our social institutions and political institutions for that matter. I don't even think of them so much anymore as cohesive units. Rather, they are constituted, right, yeah, because they are constituted of individuals, of hyper-individualistic individuals who have their own particular goals. And so if a particular individual, right, so we can, and this is part of the problem of oikophobia and late civilizational decadence, that all of these things that we think of as larger units and as cohesive wholes are broken down to their smaller components. And so if a particular individual who's a part of an institution can advance himself at the expense of his institution, well, then so much the better for him as he sees it. And so a lot of and this is something that is you mentioned, this is the attention economy. I mean, this is something that is encouraged by a society of cliques and social media. A particular person can gain immediate, instant fame or notoriety or adoration from the oikophobic crowds. I mean, the same happens on the other side of the political spectrum as well, but can do that by going against his own institution or by doing something that might not be in the long-term interest of the institution as a whole. So I think that happens all the time and more frequently now than perhaps 30 or 40 years ago. So I think that goes a long way toward explaining why institutions act in a way that does not appear to be in its own self-interest. I mean, a recent example is Disney, for example. I don't know if that's maybe not what kind of an institution that is, but you have things that, yeah, you would say that it's a cultural institution that goes back decades, almost a century, and you have they're doing things that you must think, well, that cannot possibly be in their interest. And yet it may be in the interest of a particular individual in that corporation who does it, because they gain notoriety and they gain overnight fame and so on. And the same thing I think goes for political institutions, cultural, all kinds of institutions. The one thing you said, that this sort of surplus value, I'm not sure if I would look at it as a surplus value, because it's because I don't see any underlying value to it. I think it's the only value, or maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I think it's the only value of victimhood. That one can elevate oneself in this way. I mean, as we mentioned before, victimhood becomes a kind of currency, and it becomes a currency. I think that's important to note. It becomes a currency for the individual at the expense of institutions.
In our preliminary conversation, you mentioned that as a Jew, you were viewed somewhat askance when you decided to study classical philology. That's been on my mind a lot when thinking about the apocalypse and the Maccabean revolt. Here come the cosmopolitan Greeks to Jerusalem, and right next to the temple, they build a gymnasium where naked athletes work out. What's so curious is the rich Jews understand the dealing with a superior culture. It has philosophy, thoroughly sublime institutions, and that's very, very seductive. So a kind of civil war breaks out where the lower classes, with equal vehemence, begin turning against the Greek occupiers and against those in their own ranks not longer wanting to be circumcised because they want to look naked like Greeks. And although Judas Maccabee can win this war, from then on, the Jews have philosophy on their hand. What seems to be a burden is historically an enormous progress for Western culture and civilization. It's from here that Judeo-Christian thinking is relieved out, which provides the basis for universalism. It's, in this sense, you might say, the oikophobia we're laboring over is evidence of this profound historical upheaval. And perhaps the main dilemma is that actors don't want to come to terms with the changes and the unknown futures. And here, I come to the explanation for this psychic inflation. Victor Hugo once said, "There's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come." Whereas I say, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has passed, because you can get it below cost, like a t-shirt that you got on sale. From there, the question of oikophobia becomes, it's always when a society begins losing its future that the specters return.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. It's yeah, I mean, it's a slight rephrasing maybe, but yeah, I agree with that. It's since oikophobia, as we've talked about, is something that happens only in the decadent phase of a civilization. You don't have oikophobes early on in a society. Since it's a sign of decadence and decline of a society, it stands to reason that it goes hand in hand with the loss of future, or a decline, with the disappearance of future, as you say, because oikophobia and the decline and the concomitant decline of a society entail the end of a paradigm. It entails the end of that particular social paradigm, and so in that sense, it does entail the lack of a future, because you can't progress anymore within that particular paradigm, and in that sense, it's the loss of a future. And whether we call that progress or not is, as I mentioned before, I take a sort of non-normative view of history. And so whether, for example, the Judeo-Christianization of the Roman Empire was progress in a normative sense, I think it's maybe questionable, but that's a whole other discussion. So I would say that it's progress. At least it's progress in the sense that, I mean, things are moving along. Things are moving. There is movement in that sense. It's progress, sure.
Okay.
But well, I'm glad to yes, exactly, yeah, no, to cause a laugh. But what can be said is that whether the explosion of a particular paradigm, if the paradigm is something that deserves to be, I mean, one can certainly say that the Roman Empire was so decadent already that the explosion of that paradigm was perhaps a form of progress. But be that as it may, the thing is that the future does disappear in the sense that we are talking about the end of a paradigm. And you see this, of course, in oikophobia and in the sort of display of virtue and self-glorification that has been a theme now for us in this conversation. The one difference between virtue earlier on in the paradigm and in the oikophobic phase of a paradigm is that the virtue's ideal, let's see, I just want to think of how to phrase this. The virtue's ideal earlier in a society is something that actually exists. It is something that is within that paradigm, right? It is captured by that paradigm. And so when a person strives to be virtuous in an earlier phase of that civilization, that could be a fruitful striving because the virtue is something really existing in a person, and the virtuous person strives to be that ideal which that social paradigm offers. Whereas when you're talking about the collapse, the lack of a future and the end of a particular paradigm, virtuous striving then at that phase of society becomes toward an ideal that does not exist, because that particular ideal is outside of that paradigm. And so virtuous striving now is not toward a particular possible ideal, which is to say virtuous striving isn't really virtuous because it strives towards something that is outside of that paradigm. That is to say, virtuous striving is something that seeks to turn that paradigm inside out, or that seeks to turn the world on its head, basically. And so the only purpose of virtuous striving when future has been lost is the display of the virtuous person himself. And it is not the attempt at actual possible virtue. It's perceived as such, of course, but that's not what it is. And so that's another way in which I think one recognizes the loss of future, namely the fact that virtue has become purely solipsistic. And it's only referring it's only self-glorification, and it's the compensatory gesture and everything that we've been talking about. It is not striving toward an actual ideal anymore, even if it is believed to be that. So that's a loss of future, certainly.
So I found reading your books so stimulating, especially how you lay out the historical parts, because the past is really a space of resonance for understanding the present, isn't it? Which is wonderful. What I find less comprehensible is your idea of eternal return. Yes, structures repeat themselves, but there's also progress. Couldn't it also be that in the long run, shaking up the spiritual foundation can be quite fruitful? That, as Martin would say, something like a new America of the head emerges. The other thing to consider is, when I took Heidegger from Dreyfus, he posed the question of what makes the Greek miracle so important? What makes Western culture hotter than all the rest? At the time, he couldn't answer the riddle himself, so he issued it to us as kind of a challenge to contemplate. In a certain sense, it seems to me there's something very important about the Western religious machine. Isn't that part of what you write about?
Yeah. I mean, there is, we talked about progress. There is, what I say in the book is not that it's cyclical, but that it's helical. I mean, that the movement of Oikophobia anyway is helical. Sorry? Spiral, right, exactly. It's a spiral, yeah. And so in that sense, I mean, there is progress now. Again, if you're using progress in a normative sense, I'm not quite on board, but there is progress in the sense that, I mean, things do change. And again,
we're not into normalcy.
Right, okay, right. No, it's, and again, this is something as I said, this is why I'm not a big fan of Spengler, because, again, everything is just the same all the time. So, I mean, it depends. So first, this is another point, actually, I make in the book. So one has to make, I think, an important distinction that we're not talking about a total history. Excuse me. Certain things progress. I mean, certain things progress regardless. They're always progressing, and other things don't. And there is sometimes this sort of attempt to cram everything down into the same paradigm or into the same model, whereas even the progress of one area can be intimately associated with the regress of another area. And in terms of progress, I mean, there's certain, I mean, within one cycle or within one movement, within one paradigm, there's of course certainly progress within there. And one can even like a particular step within a paradigm and yet realize that it's going later on to lead to something that's not that is not as salutary. And this is part of and this is also part of, I mentioned before that I've been criticized for not taking a stronger stand for or against certain things, for or against certain phenomena in history. And my problem with that is simply that if you're going to write a universal history of a particular phenomenon or something to that effect, one has to sort of have a multilinear mind. One cannot simply say, yeah, this is good, this is bad. One has to see the whole thing. And when one does that, the whole idea of being for or against becomes sort of secondary, because in order to have a quote unquote, again, universal look at something, one has to take into account several areas of knowledge. One has to look at something philosophically and culturally, anthropologically and historically and ethically and so on. And all of these things, all of these different areas of knowledge will yield different results. They're not all going to yield the same result as we try to evaluate a particular phenomenon. And so one has to have a multilinear mind. One sees good and bad in the same thing, in the exact same phenomenon, depending on the lens through which one views it. So when we talk about progress, I think that, I mean, you say you're a post-atheist, which is an interesting term. I mean, God is always going to make a comeback in some form or other, right? Even once he has been rejected, he always comes back in some form or other.
So, what are your plans for the future? And how will Benedict Beckeld escape the seduction of oikophobia, which is, after all, the seduction of resentment and the politics of envy? You know, when Nietzsche said, when fighting monsters, beware that you don't become a monster yourself.
I'm sure there are those who would say that it's already too late, but
Voldemort.
Right.
Yeah. I've seen.
Well, so I think actually,
are you? You're doing some workout. I've seen that.
I do work out rigorously. It's part of the Greek ideal. Yes, it's my the gym is my church, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay.
That's my community. But I think that the avoiding becoming a monster oneself, I think this sort of disinterestedness that I mentioned before is a part of that. And that's why I mean, I've been mostly criticized by the left, but I have also been criticized by the right for not being conservative enough. Right?
Oh yeah.
And for example, so there is a little bit of that, and I'm, in a way, I take it as a. I mean, I don't want to be resentful in this. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes everybody angry just for the sake of it. I think that's its own form of resentment. There is this sort of centrist tendency where centrism becomes its own idol and becomes just another ideology, and in a way, centrism in that sense is kind of unprincipled and egotistical, because it sort of suggests, well, everybody is stupid. Right, I am the only one who's enlightened. I here in the middle, while you people on the sides, you're out fighting your silly battles, and that's an attitude I also want to guard against, because centrism has become this sort of has become another sort of vain mask that people wear to sort of to sort of rise above the din and to consider themselves more enlightened and so on, which I think is nonsense. If you have principles, you have principles, and sometimes they will lead in one direction more than another. But I think a certain disinterestedness is a good way of guarding against becoming a monster. I mean, I'm writing a bunch of other things now too that have nothing to do with oikophobia, and which I think is also quite healthy, because one doesn't want to be a one-trick pony, and one doesn't want to be what the Germans like to call Fachidiot, which is a great word. A person who just does one single thing in his discipline, and so which is also something if I may say so, that what I like about Western self-contempt, if I may make a comment on my own work, is that I like the interdisciplinarity of it, the fact that it's not which I think is something that's useful, and so right now I'm working a lot on aesthetics, for example, and which is I mean, it's a little bit related, but not that much.
So what's the next project?
I even wrote a memoir on my
What's the next?
Well,
project?
I wrote a memoir on the time I spent as a so the next project is it's already finished, actually. I wrote a memoir on the time I spent as a teacher in Eastern Namibia in the Kalahari Desert, which is obviously a completely different kind of book. I mean, it has philosophical elements in it, but of course it's a completely different kind of book. and that's already finished, and I have to try to find a publisher for it. It's difficult because we live.
That's a great story to tell Hopkins
Yeah.
about it, because he doesn't know.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about it in our conversation before, but just tell it a little bit. Like
Right, a little bit, yeah.
you having done your PhD in Germany, and all of a sudden
Right.
you'd like to spend some time doing some work which is kind of like worthful, and so you go to Southern Africa as a teacher.
Yeah. So I was in a small village in the middle of the Kalahari Desert, close to the border to Botswana, and teaching English and things like this, basic computer skills, and various useful pieces of knowledge, anti-HIV prevention, things like this, in a school there. But it was a difficult situation because. And this is much of what the memoir is about, actually. I'm not going to give away too much, but it's basically about the fact that there was a lot of violence in the village from the other teachers. So I was the only Westerner there. And there was not just corporal punishment in the schools, which is, one would expect, obviously. We had corporal punishment in schools here in the West, too, until not so long ago. But it wasn't just that. It was extreme corporal punishment. Students were being beaten bloody just for getting a question wrong on a test. And there was a lot of sexual assault and rape by the teachers of the female students and so on. And so since I was the only, as a Westerner, I was the one teacher who was not engaging in these practices. And so the students came to me for protection against the other teachers, which of course put me in a very delicate and precarious kind of a situation. And so the book is about that, really. But the problem why that's going to be very difficult, I think, to get published, maybe even more difficult than to get What's in Self-Contempt published, is that we live now in a society, certainly here in the United States, that thinks everything is about racism. And so if a white person writes anything about Africa, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, a white person writing anything about Africa is going to be considered a racist, of course. Especially in my case. Now, I say a lot of positive things about the culture, and I express a lot of love for the students also that I had there. But obviously, I'm also pointing at certain bad behavior that took place within the tribe. It was the Herero tribe. And obviously, if you're a white person writing about some African tribe, you're only allowed to say positive things. If you point to any negative aspect, everyone will immediately think that you're a racist, of course. And so I think that's going to be a difficult book to get published, but hopefully it'll work out. I'm very stubborn, so that's one advantage.
That's good.
Yeah. And the next project, which I'm working on right now, which is more philosophy again, that's more within aesthetics. It's more about the relationship between art and society, and what the one teaches us about the other, and so on. I'm working on that right now.